All right, I'm joined today by Dr. Laura Hamill. Now, Dr. Laura is an organizational psychologist and business leader. She focuses on the intersection of science and HR. Her PhD is in industrial and organizational psychology from Old Dominion University, and she's also got a BA in psychology from University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. A little bit about her professional background. She was a co-founder at Limeade, an organization that many of you are going to be familiar with already. And she has the interesting dual role there of being chief science officer and chief people officer, which is a pretty rare combination, I'm sure. She's worked as director of people research at Microsoft, and these days is the owner of Paris Phoenix Group. Laura's research is focused on employee well-being, employee engagement, and organizational culture. They might think the fact that Laura used to work at Microsoft would mean that we overlapped before. Strangely, Laura used to live just a couple of blocks away from me, and I probably saw her walking a golden retriever one time. But now we do know each other, and we're a couple of thousand miles apart. So I just guess that's the world we live in today. Welcome to the pod, Laura.
Awesome. Thanks so much for having me, Paul. I know it's kind of funny, huh?
Yeah.
I really close neighbors, but didn't know each other.
Yeah, that probably says a lot about society.
Yeah, seriously. Well, and also
yeah.
the rain, right?
Yeah.
Being inside too much.
Yep. All right. So we often use these discussions to go over themes in a book. Now, your book is coming out in 2024, so I'm afraid you're going to have no idea where my questions are coming from. I want to approach the three things that I mentioned in the intro, though. So well-being, employee engagement, and organizational culture. And I want to kind of approach them as layers. So let's start with employee well-being. Really simple question to kick us off here. Why should an employer care about the well-being of employees, period? I mean, for a long time, there wasn't a lot of care.
Yeah, that is very true. That's kind of an understatement, right? The idea of actually thinking about the human being that was inside the employee was not common, right? For us to acknowledge that people are full people and they have lives outside of work and that they're complex and there's lots of different components to them, right? We didn't care about that for a long time. And I'm just thrilled to say that I have seen that really radically shift. I had the privilege of, you mentioned, helping to start Limeade. And we started Limeade a long time ago, before COVID, and before people were talking about well-being in general. And when we were first starting, people kind of confused us with focusing on wellness. And which is sort of like a dirty word in my head because it shouldn't be, but it's a little bit too focused on what's wrong with people, right? Like lose weight, stop smoking, don't get in an accident. And what we're talking about instead is how do you have a high quality of life, right? How do you have the best life you can have? And so in my time starting Limeade, we would go and try to sell the product and people would laugh at us and say, this is ridiculous. This has nothing to do with anything. We don't care about it. Now, fast forward, and it's not been that long. Most organizations understand that they should care about the well-being of their employees. So I think the pandemic taught a lot of organizations that they had to care. But before that, we were starting to see that, oh gosh, if I actually show authentically to my employees that I care about them as human beings, guess what? They care back for the organization, right? There's this much more of a mutual commitment that starts to be demonstrated when you actually care about people as human beings. So that's at the kind of most basic level, is that I see you, I care about you, and that gets reciprocated back from the employee. So I'm just thrilled that we've seen that kind of shift.
Yeah, I mean, it's really interesting. We work with companies that are all across the United States and increasingly across the world, and we still to this day we see a difference in terms of between some companies and other companies in terms of how they think about their employees. And there's still a few out there that think about this as being some kind of like, well, I don't know, some hippie thing. Is a recent comment that I had a CEO say to me.
Really?
Yeah. So I'm really curious about the evidence, qualitative or quantitative, that is there that this does have meaningful impact. What have you seen in terms of evidence either at Limeade or elsewhere?
Yeah, I mean, what's really cool is that now there's starting to be more and more and more evidence of the connection between well-being and outcomes organizations might care about. I think there's an important kind of in-between layer, which is probably what you're about to get to, but the connection between well-being and employee engagement. So we've known for a long time that when people are engaged at work, when they have that deep connection to their work, when they feel that extra energy about their work, it's good for them and it's good for the business, right? That tends to be that energy creates better results. You get higher levels of customer satisfaction, customer loyalty, innovation, like really any business result you might care about. There's been a study that's been linked with employee engagement, right? So we've known for a long time that employee engagement is something we want to increase. The problem, though, is we've been focusing a long time on this idea of more, like keep going, you got to win. And really what that's done is led to a lot more of an emphasis or more of a outcome of burnout, right? So we've had more and more people who are like, I can't keep doing this. I can't sustain these levels of performance and killing myself every day. So that kind of overemphasis most organizations have had on engagement and more without a focus on well-being has been kind of part of the problem. And now we're starting to realize you need both of those things. You need well-being and employee engagement really together if you want to sustain high levels of performance. So that to me is a really important kind of combination to be thinking about, is this idea of, I use the analogy of engagement as kind of being the engine, right? The engine that runs an organization. It's everything happens through that engine, but well-being is the fuel, right? Well-being is the way that we sustain that we keep going. And so we have to keep refueling. We have to find ways to take a break and make sure that the engine is actually healthy. So that combination of caring about people as whole people, meaning caring about their physical health, their emotional health, caring about, what happens from that outside of work, all of can help us have employees who really feel engaged at work if we really authentically care about their well-being. So to me, I don't really separate those two too much. It's really that they have to work hand in hand. And again, I think that I was part of the kind of era at work where we were focusing just on engagement, right? And like you wanted to find that person. I was hired at Microsoft because I had a twinkle in my eye. You were just trying to hire the people who had that energy and that drive, and you just wanted to keep hiring those people and not do much after they actually worked there.
Yeah.
To support them and to help them keep going, right? So it was all about hiring those go-getters. That was the focus. And so I am glad now that we have moved more towards saying, okay, yeah, engagement still matters, but we also have to realize these are human beings here, and they can't sustain that kind of go, all the way throttle down all the time for endless periods of time. We've got to care about them as human beings too. So for me, those two kind of go hand in hand.
Yeah, we'll get on to the engagement piece of it specifically in a moment here, but there's something you mentioned there that I really want to touch on, which is the employee that you hire. If that employee is with you for any lengthy period of time, that employee is going to go on a journey, and not all of that journey is going to be sunshine and roses. We often, when we work with people, we sometimes have a little bit of a hard conversation with them when we start talking about how they should think about their medium term. Because a lot of people, they think about short term, how do I keep going? How do I keep going faster? Encouraged by their companies in many cases. Like, how do you keep pushing? And we encourage them to talk about, okay, well, let's say that you're going to be still in work in 20 years time, or in 30 years time, or in 40 years time. What's going to happen over the course of that next 10 years or 20 years or 30 years or 40 years? Well, what's likely to happen is you're probably going to have at some point some crappy personal health outcome that you've got to deal with. Your parent, if you don't, your parents are. If that doesn't, you're going to have some challenges with your kids. And if you look forward 10 years versus look back 10 years, then statistically, it's much more likely that you're going to have a higher proportion of challenges going forward 10 years than you do the previous year, because personally, you're going to be 10 years older. And so the reason that we have those conversations with people is we try to encourage them to take a view of themselves, to be like, how do you sustainably behave, right? How do you work in such a way that you've got an effort that you can sustain over a long period of time? If you do so, you can be effective inside the companies. Well, I think companies need to do the same thing, right? If you're going to, ideally, if you want to retain people, you've got to understand that the human beings that you're going to retain are going to face challenges, and they're going to have ups and downs and so on. I wanted to bring it up with you specifically because I know, based on, having seen you speak and you talk about your personal journey, that you've had some of those challenges yourself. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that is kind of like maybe the definition of realizing you're an adult, right? When you to the point and you say, "Oh, I get it now. That there are ups and downs, and everybody has ups and downs, right?" And that's actually that's what life is. And I think that there's this naive view when I was younger is like, no, I'm gonna control my life so well that it's going to be perfect, right? Like there's not going to be anything hard about my life because I'm going to figure it all out. And I think that's the, kind of the realization is like, oh yeah, everybody has things that are hard, right? Including me. So yeah, I definitely, you've heard kind of the long version, Paul. But yeah, I've had different things that have happened to me in my life that I would say aren't awful by any means, but that were challenging in terms of like me deciding what I wanted to do from a career perspective. So, some of the things that I could think of that are maybe noteworthy is after I had kids. When I have two kids, one of them is 23 and one's 19. So they are definitely on their own now, mostly. But when they were really little, it was hard. And it's interesting because it wasn't right when I had them, right? It wasn't right when I gave birth to them. It was actually when they were old enough to start telling me the impact that I was having on them by working all the time. And that was when I was working at Microsoft and I didn't see them. There was daycare and a nanny that saw them more than I did. And I wasn't there for dinner most nights. Maybe a few nights, but not most nights during the week. And it was just really hard. But the thing, the clincher for me is when my son one day said to me, I think by that point, he was probably like 4 or 5 years old. And he looked at me one day and said, "Mommy, why do you worry all the time?" And it was just heartbreaking. I couldn't believe it. He could see me, right? He saw what was really going on. It's like, damn it, I thought I was hiding that really well. And I wasn't. And that to me was like the start of, I've got to change something. I've got to make a change. And so I decided to leave that job and started my own consulting practice with having just a low kind of expectation. Really, I just wanted to be able to pay my bills. I didn't have any great expectation that I was going to do anything that interesting or innovative. It ended up that I really did. I had just an amazing experience when I started my consulting business the first time. So this was a long time ago in 2006. That's where I met the person who started Limeade. We kind of created the company and the Bellevue Public Library. At that time, which was pretty funny, there were signs on the doors of Bellevue Public Library that said "No startups." There were so many people.
Oh, wow. Nobody wanted to pay for WeWork or something.
Exactly. Yeah, go get your own space. Don't take up the carols of Bellevue Public Library with your startup. So I would have so many books and articles that looked like we were in school, right? Because we were really studying the science of well-being as kind of the start of the company. So anyway, so there have been different times in my life where I've had to make changes, I guess, is sort of the net of it. And those changes for me have been really cool, like really scary, but also then ending up being really awesome. And like the last change I made was I left Limeade. And that was really hard, right? Is one of the kind of people who started the company, and really I felt such a deep connection to that place. But it was just not working for me anymore. I was really, from a kind of emotional well-being perspective and a physical well-being perspective, I sort of dreaded my days, and I didn't want to live my life in a way that I dreaded the next day, so I decided to leave. And it took me a while to get kind of my feet underneath me, but I did. And now I'm doing some really fun stuff and doing things that make me get excited about my days. So I think sort of the net of it is like trying to figure out what needs to change, right? And how you have just kind of the gumption to go do it.
Yeah, I think I think that last piece of it, and I remember when you were speaking at an event that I was at, and you were talking about the sort of dreaded feeling you get on a Sunday when you're going to go back to work on a Monday. And sometimes it's difficult to differentiate with whether that's just having a bad week or a bad month, or that's the universe telling you something. But sometimes it's really important to listen to those signals and use it as an opportunity to go do something else.
And that's where well-being comes in too, right? Because I really believe there are physical signals that you're getting. Like I had tonight, a really bad tinnitus in one of my ears, and talk about a signal, right?
Yeah.
Clang. Yeah. This is clearly a signal from my body, right, that I need to be listening. And I think a lot of times we don't listen to those, and we don't make that connection with how we're really feeling inside with the signals that we're getting from our bodies, that we need to change something. It's all connected.
It is. And the point of view that I give on that is that so this is something I've observed in myself. This is something that that we've also seen in some of the people that we work with. Sometimes using kind of traditional measures as to what should be right and should be good confuses us a little bit. I remember when I was working at Microsoft myself, and I was doing some work there, whereby on all those traditional measures, the stuff that's in Dan Pink's book, Drive, where it's autonomy, mastery, and purpose, I kind of had a ton of all three. And yet there was something missing for me. And so that's can make it harder to read those signals if on paper everything looks right. If you have, let's say, for example, you have the perfect job, you want it to be X for your entire life, you wanted to work for this company your entire life, and now you're there and now you're living the dream, and that doesn't feel right. It almost feels like selfish that you would move on from that into something else. And you can kind of imagine your friends talking to you and saying, wait a minute, you're crazy. You've got this great job at this great company. Why would you do that? So to like push through that and read the signals, then that can be particularly challenging.
Completely. And that made me think of something that happened to me right around the time I was thinking about leaving Limeade. The word selfish was like that really like hit me when you said that, because there was like almost this hesitation for me to like articulate what I really wanted, because to your point of like being so connected to what I thought I should be and I thought I should want. And my therapist said to me, why don't you just design, because I kept focusing on this idea of like dreading my day. And so she said, why don't you design, like, what would your perfect day be? And I'm like, oh, can I do that? And like, it was so funny that a way I was like almost embarrassed to say like what my perfect day would be, because I think it was the inference of, well, would people say I don't care about my profession? Would people say, well, who does she think she is to be able to say that? Because my perfect day has a lot to do with, I'm an early riser, but I like to take my time getting ready. I like to take my time drinking coffee, and I would love to be able to work out in the morning. Right. And so all these things that like, oh, could I say that? Could I do that? And, maybe I don't want to have meetings all day. Maybe I just want to have like a few meetings in a day. Maybe I even want to take the time to eat lunch. What an idea, so anyway, it was quite an exercise, and it was interesting. It was less about the exercise of writing that down, but the feeling I had of like, who am I to be able to have my perfect day?
Yeah.
Like, do I deserve that? Should I even ask for that? It was weird how like selfish, embarrassing it felt to even articulate that. And interestingly, now I'm doing that. And it doesn't feel selfish and it doesn't feel embarrassing. It feels awesome. I mean, there's a whole bunch of privilege that's built into that, right? And
Yeah.
many years of working hard to get to the point where I can have a consulting practice, that allows me to do that, right? So I don't want to pretend that that isn't true, but it's pretty darn awesome to go from a place of just constantly trying to like keep your head above water to a place where I feel like a human being again,
Yeah, and I think it's important to say, I mean, we're not claiming here that we're not claiming here that just because you want to live on a 60-foot yacht that means automatically you will,
right?
or any of those things. And as you point out, right, there is we're talking about very first world problems here, right?
Yes, 100%.
Yeah, but at the same time, it still, if you can't even acknowledge to yourself what it is that you want or what it is that you're looking for, then it's very difficult to design an environment around you that gives you that. And then there's something else that I was just thinking of as you were touching on those themes, which was really kind of, I would say, the connection between what we've just been talking about and designing an environment in the way that you want it to be designed and employee engagement.
Yeah.
So it's pretty clear, as you point out, that that how people work and the nature of the work arrangements that people have can be closely aligned to their employee engagement. Now, I've read, I'm sure you have too, many people have, many of our listeners will have read it as well, these Gallup surveys that come out each year that look at employee engagement. The figures are always terrible, and they seem to dip as well.
Right.
What do you think of those surveys? Do you think it's real that employee engagement is really as low as is claimed? And aside from what we've been talking about, is it really possible to improve employee engagement from the perspective of an employer?
Yeah. So I think those are real. And I do think it's dropping. I do believe our whole relationship with work is something that maybe in 50 years we'll look back at it and say, wow, isn't that wild the way that happened, right?
Mm-hmm.
I just think about the way I thought about how I was going to work when I was young. And the idea was just get a really well-paying job and just go there every day, right? And I'm going to work my ass off and everything's going to be peachy. And it was just such a simplistic view of what I thought work was going to be. And I put up with a lot of crap. I mean, a lot of crap. Lots of discrimination, lots of sexual harassment. I mean, I have stories, right? And most people do, most women especially do.
Yep.
And there were a lot of really crappy things that I really think my daughter would not put up with, right? She just wouldn't. And I love that. I think that we're realizing that all our hopes and dreams are not going to come true by just finding that one special place that's going to fulfill all of our career dreams. I really think our shift is happening around what we think we're going to get from work. And so because of that, I think we're just a little disillusioned, right? We're just feeling a little bit like, oh yeah, I'm not doing that. I'm not giving all of that energy. And I'm going to be a little more critical of the real experience that I'm having in this place and be honest. And a lot of organizations are there's a lot of ways that organizations are still really dysfunctional, right? I just continue to be shocked at the most basic ways that organizations aren't aligned, they're not communicating, they're not coordinated. And also, I mean, this is maybe a little niche-y kind of problem, but the way jobs are designed, I mean, there is no job design anymore. And it used to be in the olden days, I felt like here's a job and here's the responsibilities and here's the handoffs. And now what I see, and it might be because I work with a lot of tech companies too, but it's not this is not a job. Anything that we can pile on is a job until you say uncle, right? Until you say no more. And so it's just more and more and more and more. And I think people have just gotten to the point of being like, why would I do this? Why would I put all of this time and effort in and not really feel like I'm getting a lot back? And so I just feel like that's kind of a long way of saying, I feel like our relationship with work has changed so much, and we just aren't really striving to even have those high levels of engagement as employees in a lot of ways. So that's just kind of what I think is going on. I still think we should be striving for engagement. I still think we should be measuring it. But I really want to see it coupled more with well-being, as I mentioned before.
Yeah. You and I both have a lot of experience working with tech companies, and I've observed a few things that are very much in line with what you're talking about. One thing I would say is that, I mean, it's not always the case, but managers inside tech companies are frequently individual contributors who have just reached a point where they're going to take on management responsibilities. In many cases, they don't even have any interest in people management. They're just in it. And even if they are interested in it, they have very little experience and very little training in it. And in quotes, because they're smart, then they're supposed to be able to figure that out. Yeah. And in many cases, the smarts that they have got nothing to do with how you manage teams. I think that's part of the problem. The other thing, as well, as you point out, as really eloquently, I think, is this whole business about what we're expected to do. And a job description in many tech jobs is almost meaningless. I mean, it's just like it's just a collection of salad words.
Yep.
And then you just wind up and show up doing stuff. And in the meantime, your manager is loading stuff on you and then questioning why you're not getting everything done. And your CEO is every year showing up saying, all right, things are moving faster. We got to do more or less. We got to do more or less. We got to do more or less. Well,
and the result, the expectations from the board go up and up and up and up, right?
Yeah. And I think, I mean, I didn't used to think this, but I do now. I think that's kind of insulting, because if you go to your workforce and you say, all right, everybody, we've got to do more with less, what you're really saying is, I don't think you were working hard last year.
Yes.
So I think you've got at least 20% more in the tank, or I think you're spending too much time with your family, or I think that you're not giving enough to your company. We used to call that, in our team I was in, we used to call it a concept of this, similar to this, that kind of collects the two together, is something called fetch the rock, whereby the manager would say, I need you to go fetch that rock. Not tell you about anything, where it was, what it was, anything. Just need you to go fetch a rock. You'd wander off, you haul this rock, you put it on your back, you bring it all the way back, you present it, and then the manager go, not that rock. And there's so much of that inside tech companies.
Completely agree.
I wanted to just highlight this point. Some of the work that we've done recently was gain single word feedback from employees as to what's the one word that comes to mind when in relation to your job. That's it. No other additional instructions. And so I'm looking at it in front of me here, the most common words were confusing, ambiguous, unstructured, unclear, chaotic, and lonely. Isn't that awful?
Awful. And that's what I'm talking about, right? When I said dysfunctional, I mean, just the most basic ideas of what are our goals and who's doing what and how do we come together and how do we stay coordinated and how do we work on projects together? It just seems like maybe it's just the companies I'm working with. A lot of the companies I have the ability to work with, there's just struggles in the most basic ways. And so just thinking about how that impacts the human beings that work there, right? Those words just tell it all, tell such a story of that. I did a study guess it's been a couple years now, but I was asking, I think we had like 5,000 participants. It was a big survey kind of around the world. And we were asking people like, what's the biggest cause of stress for you at work? So kind of similar, but it didn't have just one word. And my mind was blown because we had a list of things to choose from that were awful things, right? Like my managers, treats me poorly, and toxic work culture, and like a whole bunch of different things. The number one by far that was probably, I think, 3 times more frequently picked than the next one down was too much work. And it's like all the other things that were on that list, like there's a HR department or HR person to deal with those things, But that one, I don't feel like we even talk about too much work. We don't even talk about like what is a job anymore. And how do we make that just functional? So I'm so with you on that.
Who in a company make sure that we don't do too much work? And I know that sounds really strange, but think about it we want our employees to perform. In the world of sports, coaches work all the time with athletes to make sure that they're not overtraining.
Yes.
Right. So who's doing that in the workplace? I'd say nobody.
And they're doing the opposite. There's a lot of people who are doing the opposite. Their job is to add more.
Yeah. Yeah. My job is to grind people into the ground. That kind of thing.
Yeah.
So I want to briefly take us into a tangential area, but I think it's one that is related. Last few months, we've been doing a lot of work around researching what I colloquially call me versus we. And it's a descriptor that we use to describe, if you like, the tension between optimizing for self and optimizing the team. So I just mentioned sports. The mental model that we use for this is actually sports teams. So if you think about, let's say, basketball and soccer and things like that, there are countless examples of basketball teams and soccer teams where if you were to look at the list of players, you'd say that is the collection of the best individual players in the league. They're going to win the league, no doubt about it. And then the season starts and they almost inevitably don't, right? Because what they are teams of high-performing individuals versus high-performing teams. So I'm really curious about this as a workplace dynamic, right? Especially as we have a tendency, particularly in the US, to reward individual achievement, individual accomplishment over contributing to teams. But the thing the organization really wants is high-performing teams and a high-performing organization. So what are your thoughts about that tension and how you go about ensuring that employees are actually part of high-performing teams?
Yeah. I love the me and we idea because to me, it's a very simple phrase that describes so much, right? And even when we're talking about topics like inclusion, me and we is a really good way to talk about that balance, right? We want to be included as a part of the bigger collective, but you also want to be seen for who you are individually, right? And so I love the me and we piece of that. Where I go, which is probably not surprising to you, is that I really focus on how the culture of the organization is emphasizing the me in this scenario that you just described. Because to me, that's what is missing in a lot of our efforts when we're trying to sort of improve something or fix something in an organization. We keep it at the climate level, right? We keep it at the level, the things that we can see and the things that are like, let's just set better goals and let's teach managers how to work together better. And those things are great, right? Those are great things to do. But when you dig deeper and you find out, well, the reason why none of those efforts work is because what's truly valued at the end of the day goes against that. And so that was kind of what you were emphasizing there in the kind of individual versus team. So many organizations truly are about you competing against your team members, right?
Yes.
You shining brighter than the people around you, because that's what matters. We're looking for that twinkle in your eye, right? We're looking for that special thing that's different about you. Go toot your horn. Let's see who is the superstar here, right? So when you kind of dig into the layers of culture and you really start to see what is it that's value, we value people being rock stars. And you could take, I mean, I don't mean to berate Microsoft, but, thinking about Bill Gates, it's all about Bill Gates, right? And that's kind of fundamental. His brilliance, the way he thinks was core to who Microsoft was. And so we're looking for the next one, right? The next special person. And so that propagates that individualism a lot. And so what is it in the culture if you're trying to focus more on the team? Well, what's the similarity, the similar construct from a cultural perspective, right? How do we think about all of the things that need to be in place culturally for people to be reinforced to help each other?
Yeah.
And it's so much more than just competition versus collaboration. That's a big part of it, right? But the collaboration you could break down on so many levels, right? Which could be a lot about trust, could be a lot about psychological safety, could be a lot about kind of feeling like you're part of the bigger purpose of this organization, that you matter to this place, that you feel included, right? A sense of belonging. And there's multiple kind of cultural attributes that I would want to dig into to see which of those are alive and well in order to kind of support that team performance. Or are we working against the tension of truly valuing things that are more about competition, tooting your horn, being special, saving the day, being a hero, right? So that's the kind of level I'd want to go to, is just dig into what's truly valued. And what's tricky about all of this culture work is that a lot of the messages we get about what's truly valued are when we look to the people who've made it in the organization, right? We look to leaders, we look to power to really understand what's valued. And that's what's really almost kind of circular about the culture problem or the culture conversation, is that many times people who are in positions of power are the ones who are kind of helping us decide how to behave. We look to them to see kind of what kind of behaviors which we should demonstrate. But they're also part of this system. They feel like they've made it, right? There's not a lot of motivation for people in leadership positions to change the system. It's reinforcing them, right? And so this is what's really tricky to me about culture, is the role of power in the conversation and in the work. And I think that's one of the reasons why it's so hard, right, to actually change culture, is that it requires the powerful, but a lot of times the powerful are too bought into the system, right? Don't want to do it. So that was a long answer, Paul.
No, and a really great one. And it reminds me of a conversation that an online conversation has been having recently about this, because the more that I work in this sphere, the more convinced I become that a lot of what is broadly accepted, even in MBAs, a lot of what is broadly accepted as being leadership traits or attributes of great leaders and things like that is really a distillation of the way in which leaders, who were almost all white men, behaved historically in successful companies.
Yes.
And it ignored the fact that you had a whole bunch of other leaders that had many of those attributes as well, and that companies were not successful. It's what I call, and he probably won't end up being a guest on my podcast because I'd slam him a little bit, but it's what I call the good to great problem, which is that it's full of basically, let's look at all these companies that have been successful and find the traits associated with the leaders in those companies. Even though I agree with some of the statements that are in there, just that exercise of like singling out these companies and then highlighting behaviors in those people ignores the fact that there are thousands and thousands and thousands of companies that have not been successful. By the way, many of those companies that were featured in that are now not successful. So we collect together this as a set of these highly masculine traits of like raw power and decisiveness. And, we must downplay things like listening and empathy and things like that, which are at least or as more valuable, but we don't highlight them because historically that's not how we've seen a leader like a Bill Gates or Steve Jobs, or go back all the way through to, back to the 1920s. Those are not the traits that we saw in those men.
That's right. That's right. And to your point, it becomes such a machine, right? Of just us assuming and thinking that's the way it's supposed to be, right? And it's really hard to break out of that. And that's what's so hard to me and makes me sad about culture work in general. Like, so much of it requires the people, the powerful, to be involved in that work, to be able to see it, to be able to have humility, and to be able to be open to other perspectives, other models than what they had access to what they saw. I'll never forget, I did a presentation at a big healthcare system, and there was a luncheon afterwards, and I sat next to the COO, and it was a big hospital system it was all men. I should take that back. I think there was one woman. And so this guy sat next to me, super nice, and he could tell he was like a little bit of a skeptic. I was talking about well-being and how important it was. And he said to me, I think I get it, Laura. I get what you're saying, but I didn't have anybody who like treated me that way. There was nobody who I worked with who like cared about me and thought about me as a human being. And he's like, I just don't know if I know how to do it, Yeah. And it's like, then it's like, that is a big part of this too, right? Is what the people who've been in power have had as role models. And they haven't had a lot of access to other ways of thinking.
Yeah. All right. Well, let's start wrapping us up here. Organizational culture, that last layer, we've eased into it already.
Yeah.
But you mentioned that organizational culture is very important, but elusive. And so I'm curious, specifically, what do you mean when you're saying elusive? And if it is elusive, how can we manage, measure, do anything around something that is deliberately elusive?
That's exactly it, Paul. That's part of the big problem. And this is what I'm writing my book on, right? Is organizational culture. So I am all about this topic. I love it. And it is the very nature and characteristics of culture that make it so damn hard to change. And this is why most organizations struggle with it. And there's probably 10 different reasons, but I'll just share a couple. Okay. First, culture is really abstract, right? We often don't have the language to describe an organization's culture. In fact, sometimes we sort of have a feeling about it, but the words, like the level of it, intensity of it, we can't really quite put our fingers on, right? And so the language within an organization is hard. But then when you think across organizations and try to compare that language, it's just a mess, right? We don't have a good taxonomy, dictionary way of describing culture in really consistent ways. So the abstract nature of culture is one reason. Another reason around this is that it is when you start in an organization, it's very apparent, right? You can see it. It slaps you in the face. Like, oh my gosh, they do that here? Whoa, I had no idea. Like, oh, people don't ask questions at company meetings, and I just asked one. Right? So you learn fast, right? When you start an organization about kind of how things are done. The thing that's mind-blowing to me about it is how fast you become part of the culture, so much so that you don't even see it anymore. And that is another huge problem, right? Because when you can see it, it's more easy to think about how you might change it. But once you can't see it anymore, it's like, what do you mean change our culture? Why would we do that? I don't even know what you're talking about. The analogy I like to use is the idea of like a fish in water, right? Water is core to, a fish's existence. But, I don't know for sure if a fish knows it's swimming in water, right? The culture is the water we swim in. And it's so part of what we do and who we are in organizations that we oftentimes can't even see it. So that's another one. I think I'll do one more, even though there's many, many more, but the first one is that it's all relative. And this is the thing that just sort of kills me about culture books in general, right? You get the Netflix book, you get, every big company that's had any success with culture writes a book and says, this is the way you do it.
Yeah.
And actually, it just doesn't work that way, right? It's all relative to the organization and all of the kind of ecosystem the organization is in. So it's not really that there's a good culture or a bad culture. It's really relative to what you're trying to do. And so it could be helping our culture could be helping us achieve our strategy, or it could be holding us back from achieving our strategy, but it's relative to us. And so there's no cookie cutter, right? There's no cookie cutter that you can just and everybody can, have a great culture. And so those are just a couple of the reasons why it's elusive and so hard for us to get our hands wrapped around. But at the same time, we know how critical it is that you have a culture that's, aligned with what you're trying to do, or you just won't do it, right? I mean, over and over again, I see that organizations, when they're having some issues, there's just this big kind of in-your-face disconnect between what the culture is and what they're trying to achieve. And it's not subtle, right? It's big, really obvious disconnects.
Wow. So many unanswered questions because I haven't had a chance to ask them because we've been talking, which has been fantastic. Let's do another one of these, and maybe we should time it for when the book is about to come out, and we can talk about many more of these issues. So complicated areas, and really, really great to talk to you about them today, Laura. Thanks for joining the pod.
Thanks so much, Paul. That was really fun. I'm with you. We could keep going, couldn't we?
Yeah.
Thank you.